Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back with another AMD spicy news. It's been some time. AMD 9800X 3D is seeing some heat from consumers as news suggests that over 100 dead Ryzen 7 9800X 3D cases have been reported till now, mostly on ASRock motherboards. In some cases, the CPU didn't even run for an hour. If we talk about ASRock, they do release the BIOS as hotfix for the 9800X 3D CPU, but it did not seem like it fixed the issue. And particularly happening in ASRock motherboards, that's worrisome for ASRock. There is something they are missing, or anything to do with microcode or mismatch or any component or any specific voltage issue like we saw in Intel's older gen CPU 13 and 14 gen, but that was totally CPU side. But in here the investigation is needed to fix the issue. Whether it's MOBO or CPU, the one who always suffer is consumers. So seeing this is very sad. The news further reports that out of 107 incidents, the majority of the 9800X 3D failure reports come from the ASRock motherboard owners, but apparently motherboard aren't damaged in most cases, and only CPU is the suspect here. Again, like last time it was with Intel's 13 and 14 gen CPU, is now happening to AMD Ryzen 7 9800X 3D CPU. But I'm not saying that AMD is to blame here, but it can be AMD CPU or ASRock, or maybe both, but consistently only a ASRock motherboard. It shifts our doubt on motherboard side rather than CPU manufacturer. But in some cases it was damaged to CPU itself. However, in some cases it ran for 9 to 10 days of usage and then sudden silent. So here is one user compiled almost all such cases, mostly from Reddit, and it came out to be roughly 107 in total in the last 2 months. And out of 107 cases, the majority of the reports are from ASRock motherboard owners, but there have been some ASUS, MSI and Gigabyte incidents as well. And most incidents happen on ASRock 800 series motherboard, including the X870 and B850. However, some CPUs also failed on 600 series motherboards. And if we see these data that is collected by the user, then our doubt shifts to AMD CPU itself rather than the motherboard partners. And going through a few of them, the most CPU failures occurred in just a few weeks, and in some cases the CPU died in half an hour. And what exactly is happening here is quite complex, because in some cases we see burned CPUs, which could indicate either overvoltage or user error, but in other cases the CPU showed no sign of physical damage, and the respective motherboards were working totally fine with alternatives such as another X3D CPU like 7800X 3D or an non-X3D CPU variants. In some incidents, the Ryzen 9800X 3D CPU failed twice, and hence user had to go through the long RMA process twice, as the news suggests. But one point to notice here is that some users who also reports that Ryzen 9800X 3D's death after turning on expo mode or manual CPU overclocking. There were cases where users didn't touch anything in the BIOS and still met with the same fate. And if I have to guess, there is all voltage issue going on here by seeing all the factors like we saw in old 13 and 14 gen CPUs. But I wonder what kind of voltage are we talking about here in case of AMD Expo profiles being enabled. But to be honest, guys, when 7800X 3D was out, there was no overclocking option, and I believe that was the good decision rather than enabling the 3D variants of the chip to be overclocked, because it's not safe, as you can see clearly here. I don't think so that by enabling the overclock and overclocking, these CPUs are safe at all. So that may be a factor that these chips can handle the overclocking, but I don't know how many of these processors are not overclocked yet seen the same fate as others. Okay guys, next up for today is that in last few weeks we saw the 9800X 3D variants of the CPU being dead after a few days and even few hours. But it's sad to see that the new AMD 9950X 3D that AMD recently launched is failing, and I think it's the first time we are seeing one such CPU fail, or maybe there are more of them, but not that I have heard of. But here is one case of failure. So the news reports that the first case of AMD Ryzen 9 9950X3D failure spotted. CPU dies within 9 days of usage on ASRock motherboard. Again, the same suspect here. So in this case, the CPU is different, but the motherboard vendor is the same as in the 9800X3D. ASRock did launch the BIOS, as I said before. That doesn't seem to work properly or to mitigate the issue at all. So the Redditor reports Ryzen 9950X3D CPU failure on ASRock Pro RX X870, but no visible sign of damage appeared. However, ASRock shared its investigation report with users stating that its motherboard didn't apparently cause any damage to the processors and claimed that cleaning the AM5 socket mitigates the Ryzen 7 9800X3D boot issue and that they have found no damage on the socket itself. So does ASRock mean to say that cleaning is the solution to boot issue in case of 9800X3D? Well, that is kind of weird, because if I buy a new motherboard, I have to service it before use just to avoid the boot issue. How stupid this is. What's your quality control doing? What are we paying for? If it's like that, what do you mean by saying cleaning? I mean, it's like saying pay us and then we will give you the component to do it yourself. I mean, come on, don't take the part that Intel did and see where they are now. Now, as per Redditor, what he claims that he ran the latest BIOS 3.20 and used the Kingston Fury 64GB RAM kit at 6000 MT per second. The problem appeared unexpectedly and suddenly. The user didn't claim that he turned on other manual overclocking for CPU, but said that his PC suddenly froze and wouldn't boot anymore. What interesting is that his CPU didn't show any damage sign, but it's likely the CPU died and not the motherboard, because user did try turning on the system by installing his CPU on another motherboard from different vendor, but that also didn't work, so the CPU was dead. As per his claims, there was no explosion, no burn marks, no sign of damage to the socket either. And in case if you are wondering if this CPU was running hot, he confirmed that the temperatures was fine as well. And that's how he claimed that the processor died. Since his seller was offering a 14-day return window, he was able to send it back, and the seller, without having to delve into the RMA process, which is quite tedious, they gave him another processor. But again, going back to what was apparently the first case of 9950X3D failure, it wasn't on a ASRock motherboard but on ASUS X870 crosshair, and apparently it died the same way, leaving no sign of physical damage. So I mean guys, I'm not in favor of these chips being used for overclocking, because it's not safe, not in my opinion, because we did not see such issues in older X3D variants of chip, and because that's the only big feature among others is that it can be overclocked. So I think if we talk about the 9000 series X3D processors, the main difference the other X3D and this present one is that these chips can be overclocked, and where overclocking is enabled, think of overvoltage also, and that overvoltage may be the cause of these processors to die.